For centuries, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain lived in relative peace, their monasteries untouched, their towns growing, their rulers focused on rivalries within their own land. But then everything changed. From the far north, across the cold and violent sea, came a force unlike any the English had ever seen. The year was 793 AD, and Britain was about to enter an age of war, fire, and steel. When the first Norse longships landed at Lindisfarne, they brought more than just war. They brought terror, they brought an unstoppable tide of warriors, ready to carve out their own kingdoms in foreign lands. The Anglo-Saxon world would never be the same again. The Viking Age had begun. For centuries, history books have told the story of Viking raids as little more than plunder and destruction, a wave of mindless violence that eventually faded away. But is that really the whole story? What if I told you that the Vikings weren't just raiders, that they weren't just plunderers, that is what they really wanted, was something far greater? Because the truth is, these Norse warriors didn't just come to burn monasteries and sail away. They came to stay, they came to rule, they came to reshape Britain itself. We will not sell nonsense in this video. We study these topics in depth to provide as much serious historical knowledge as possible. Neil Price, leading historian for Vikings history in his best-selling book, Children of Ash and Elm, writes, "The Vikings did not simply arrive, they transformed. They imposed their rule, reshaped the landscape, and left a legacy that echoes into the modern world." Their impact wasn't just felt in battle, but in law, language, and culture. The very foundation of what would become England was shaped, in part, by these Norse invaders. So how did they do it? How did a scattered force of warriors evolve into rulers of vast territories, carving out entire kingdoms within England? And how did the Anglo-Saxon world fight back? This is the story of the Viking invasions, a tale of blood and steel, of kings and warlords, of survival and transformation. And by the end of this video, you will see why the Vikings were far more than just raiders. This is part 3 of our historical series on the Viking invasions of England. In the first 2 episodes, we trace the origins of the Viking threat, from the fateful raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD to the terrifying rise of the Great Heathen Army nearly a century later. We explored the collapse of Northumbria, the martyrdom of King Edmund, and the early struggles of Wessex to resist Norse conquest. If you haven't watched those chapters yet, we encourage you to do so first. They lay the foundation for the events you're about to see. You'll find the links in the description below. Guthrum had brought Wessex to the brink of destruction, but Alfred had survived. The Viking conquest of England was nearly complete, but one last obstacle remained. In May 878, the two armies would meet in one of the most decisive battles in English history. The war was about to be decided, and at Edington, Alfred the Great would determine the fate of England. By the spring of 878 AD, Alfred the Great had emerged from the marshes of Athelney, no longer a fugitive, but a king reborn. After months of retreat and guerrilla warfare, he had rallied the shattered remnants of Wessex, forging them into an army of survivors, men who had lost their homes, their families, but not their will to fight. His opponent Guthrum had no reason to believe that Wessex posed any further threat. His forces had spent months occupying much of the kingdom, raiding its lands and subjugating its people. He had crushed Alfred once, and he saw no reason why this would not happen again. But Guthrum had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated Alfred's ability to turn desperation into strength. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Cnut the Great, writes, "Alfred's genius was not just in his ability to survive, but in his understanding of time. He knew when to retreat, when to wait, and when to strike, and now the moment had come." Riding out from Athelney, Alfred called upon the remaining noblemen of Wessex to gather at Egbert's Stone, a meeting point deep in the countryside. Messengers were sent across the land, spreading word that the king had returned. It was a desperate call to arms, and thousands answered. Farmers and villagers who had seen their homes burned took up spears and axes. Noble warriors who had lost everything returned to fight for their land. The surviving elements of the Wessex Fyrd came together for one final battle. By early May 878, Alfred had assembled a force large enough to challenge Guthrum. The time had come for the final reckoning. The clash between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings took place at Edington, a strategically vital location. The battlefield was chosen carefully by Alfred, positioned on high ground, giving the West Saxons a natural advantage. The Viking army, seasoned and confident, formed a traditional shield wall, the unbreakable formation that had won them countless battles. Alfred's army, less experienced but more determined, prepared to smash against the Viking line in what would be the most crucial battle of their lives. Peter Sawyer in the Viking expansion describes the scene. The Battle of Edington was not just another Viking raid or another Anglo-Saxon skirmish. It was a moment upon which the future of England depended. If Alfred failed, there would be no more kings of Wessex, only Viking overlords. Alfred knew that defeating the Viking shield wall would not be easy. The Norse warriors were disciplined, skilled in close combat and accustomed to victory. If the West Saxons failed to break them, the battle and England would be lost. As the battle began, Alfred did something bold and unconventional. Instead of immediately throwing his entire army forward, he ordered his men to advance slowly and deliberately. Unlike in previous battles, where the Anglo-Saxons had often rushed into combat only to be outmaneuvered, this time they moved forward as a single, solid mass. They matched the Vikings, shield for shield, refusing to be drawn into the chaotic individual fighting that the Norse excelled at. The two lines collided with an earth-shaking force, the sound of clashing iron and battle cries echoing across the field. For hours, the battle raged in a brutal deadlock. The shield walls ground against each other like two immovable forces. Warriors fought hand to hand, hacking and stabbing over their shields. The air was thick with blood and the desperate cries of dying men. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes the horror of such a battle. The shield wall was a brutal, suffocating place. Men were packed so tightly that the fallen couldn't fall. They remained upright, pinned by the bodies of their comrades. It was a test of endurance as much as skill. At first, it seemed as if the Vikings would hold, their battle-hardened warriors weathering the storm. But then something changed. After what must have felt like an eternity, Alfred ordered a full-force charge. The West Saxons pushed forward with everything they had, driving against the Viking shield wall. The long battle had exhausted the Norsemen, many of whom had fought in countless previous campaigns. Alfred's tactics, combined with the desperate determination of his men, began to break through the enemy ranks. Slowly, the Viking wall began to buckle. The shield formations started to falter, gaps appearing in their once impenetrable defence. Guthrum, realizing that his army was on the verge of collapse, tried to rally his warriors, but the West Saxons pressed harder. The Vikings began to retreat, falling back toward their stronghold. The Anglo-Saxons surged forward, cutting them down as they fled. What had begun as a battle of survival had now turned into a decisive victory for Wessex. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Cnut the Great, writes, "For the first time in years, the Vikings were not the ones dictating the terms of battle. They were not the unstoppable force. They were the ones running." By the end of the day, the battlefield was littered with the dead. The West Saxons had won, but Alfred knew that the war was not over yet. The surviving Vikings retreated to their fortress, hoping to hold out for reinforcements. But Alfred was relentless. He surrounded the stronghold, cutting off supplies and escape routes. The siege lasted for 2 weeks, with the Vikings trapped inside. Finally, starving and exhausted, Guthrum was forced to surrender. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, describes Guthrum's surrender as the moment the Viking tide was finally checked. Guthrum, who had once seemed invincible, now stood before Alfred, not as a conqueror but as a man defeated. But Alfred did not execute Guthrum. Instead, he did something unexpected. He offered terms of peace, on the condition that Guthrum convert to Christianity. The Viking warlord, recognizing that he had no other option, agreed. In a symbolic act of submission, Guthrum was baptized, taking the Christian name Ethelstan. The war was over, for now. The Battle of Edington was not just a victory, it was a moment that saved Anglo-Saxon England. Alfred had done what no other English ruler had done before. He had decisively defeated the Viking invaders. Guthrum's surrender marked the beginning of a new era, the establishment of the Danelaw and the survival of Wessex as an independent kingdom. But the Viking threat was not gone. Alfred had won a battle, but the war for England's future was far from over. Under the Treaty of Wedmore, the Vikings and Saxons divided England. The north and east became Danelaw, ruled by Viking law. The south remained under Anglo-Saxon control. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, writes, "The Treaty of Wedmore was not a Viking defeat. It was a Viking foothold. The north was now theirs. The Vikings had not just come to raid, they had come to rule." The Battle of Edington in May 878 AD was more than just a military engagement. It was the moment when the fate of Anglo-Saxon England was rewritten. Alfred the Great had led the West Saxons to victory, proving that the Viking advance was not unstoppable. But victory on the battlefield did not mean an end to the war. The great heathen army had been crippled, but not annihilated. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Cnut the Great, describes the situation. By the summer of 878, the great heathen army was no longer an army. It was a broken remnant of its former self, isolated and desperate. Alfred had not just won a battle, he had outlasted an empire. With no other choice, Guthrum surrendered, but what happened next was unexpected. Instead of executing Guthrum and his remaining warriors, a fate that many expected, Alfred offered them peace. But it was a peace on his terms. Guthrum and his followers had to leave Wessex and never return. They had to formally recognize Alfred as the superior ruler. Guthrum had to convert to Christianity and accept baptism. This final condition was the most symbolic of all. Viking warriors were pagans, dedicated to the old gods of Odin and Thor. To force their leader to submit to Christian baptism was a humiliating but politically brilliant move by Alfred. Gareth Williams, in Viking Britain, an exploration, explains the baptism of Guthrum was not just about religion, it was about submission. It was a psychological victory for Alfred, a statement that he had not only defeated his enemies, but had forced them to acknowledge the legitimacy of his rule. On Whit Sunday, 878 AD, in a quiet ceremony at Alla, Guthrum was baptized, taking the Christian name Ethelstan. Alfred himself stood as his godfather, further cementing their new relationship. It was an act that signalled the beginning of a new order in England, an order that would lead to the creation of the Danelaw. The peace agreement between Alfred and Guthrum was not just a truce, it was a complete reorganisation of England's political landscape. Over the next few years, a formal treaty was drafted, known to history as the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum. This document officially divided England into two spheres. Wessex and its allied territories remained Anglo-Saxon. The eastern and northern parts of England, now under Viking rule, became known as the Danelaw. The treaty outlined fixed borders, setting the boundary at Watling Street, a major Roman road running from London to Chester. Everything to the west of this line remained under Alfred's rule. Everything to the east became the domain of the Danes. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking expansion, describes this as a remarkable political settlement, unprecedented in Viking history. It was not a tribute agreement, nor was it a temporary ceasefire. It was the recognition of a new reality. The Vikings were no longer invaders, they were now rulers. The Danelaw was born. The creation of the Danelaw was one of the most radical shifts in early medieval England. For the first time, England was divided not just by political control, but by culture, language, and law. The Danelaw was not just a Viking-occupied territory, it was a region where Norse customs, governance, and legal systems took root, permanently influencing the development of English society. Language, Norse words merged with Old English, leading to linguistic influences that persist in English today, e.g., thrift, window, knife. Law and justice. The Danelaw operated under Danish legal traditions which were distinct from those of the Anglo-Saxons. Land ownership. Viking settlers established new farming communities, with land ownership patterns differing from those in Wessex. City growth. Norse traders revitalized towns, turning places like York into thriving commercial centres. Eleanor Parker in Dragon Lords explains, the Danelaw was not just a conquered land, it was a hybrid world where Viking and Anglo-Saxon influences fused together, creating a new cultural and economic reality. Though politically divided, England was now a land of two peoples, their histories forever intertwined. One of the most striking consequences of the Danelaw was the transition of the Vikings from raiders to settlers. Many Viking warriors chose to remain in England rather than return to Scandinavia. They took Anglo-Saxon wives, raising children who were neither fully Viking nor fully English. Large numbers of Danish farmers and craftsmen migrated to the Danelaw, seeking fertile land and new opportunities. This shift from warrior culture to agrarian society mirrored similar transformations in Viking-controlled lands in Ireland, Scotland, and Normandy. The Vikings were not just plunderers, they were pragmatic rulers who knew how to adapt to new realities. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, observes, the creation of the Danelaw was a defining moment in Viking history. It was proof that the Norse were not just destroyers, they were also builders. They had come to England as conquerors, but many stayed as landowners and lords. This period also saw an increase in trade as Viking merchants established networks that linked England with Scandinavia, the Frankish Empire, and beyond. The cultural and economic integration of the Danelaw into the wider medieval world had begun. The Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum had brought an end to one chapter of the Viking Wars, but it did not end the Viking presence in England. The Danelaw was a compromise, not a final resolution. Alfred had saved Wessex, but England remained divided. The Vikings had gained a kingdom, but they had lost their unchallenged dominance. The Anglo-Saxons and the Norse would now coexist, but tensions would remain. Would the Danelaw survive in the long term? Or was it merely a pause in the larger struggle for control of England? Only time would tell. What would drive a king to murder his own mercenaries, to burn civilians alive in a church? On St. Brice's Day, November 13th, in the year 1002, King Ethelred II of England ordered the killing of Danes living within his kingdom. What followed was a massacre, but was it justice or panic? Modern archaeology and ancient charters reveal a story of fear, betrayal, and political desperation that may have changed the fate of England forever. The massacre did not occur in a vacuum. In the final decades of the 10th century, Anglo-Danish relations were deteriorating rapidly. Danish raids had resumed with intensity, and between 997 and 1001, Viking warbands laid waste to towns along the southern coast. The Battle of Maldon in 991, a catastrophic defeat for the English, symbolized the helplessness of Ethelred's forces. In response, the king resorted to paying Danegeld, a tribute to dissuade further attacks, an act perceived by many as weakness. The historian Barbara York, an expert in early medieval England, contextualizes this fear bluntly. It was the type of hard-hitting reply that was necessary in a world inhabited by Vikings. Yet not all Danes in England were raiders. Many were settlers, merchants and farmers who had intermarried and assimilated in regions such as Wessex. Others were mercenaries, hired by Ethelred himself to protect the realm, some of whom had turned on him. According to the Anglo-Saxon chronicle, Ethelred was informed that a conspiracy was forming among the Danes. They would beshrew him of his life, and afterwards all his council, and then have his kingdom without resistance. In response, Ethelred issued a royal decree that all Danes living in England, those who had sprung up in this island, were to be killed. His 1004th charter, issued 2 years after the massacre, described this as a most just extermination. He likened the Danes to cockle among the wheat, suggesting a corrupting presence that had to be purged. Simon Keynes, former professor of Anglo-Saxon at Cambridge, argues that this act, while extreme, reflected a population traumatized by betrayal. This was a reaction of a people who had suffered under repeated Danish attacks through mercenaries who had turned on their employers. It was not, he insists, a policy of ethnic genocide, but a desperate military decision. One of the most well-documented instances of the killings occurred in Oxford. Danes living in the town, realizing what was about to unfold, sought sanctuary in St. Fridswide's church. But the townspeople, unable to remove them, burned the church to the ground. Ethelred's charter records this event with chilling clarity. Those Danes entered this sanctuary of Christ, but when all the people in pursuit strove to drive them out and could not, they set fire to the planks and burnt, as it seems, this church with its ornaments and its books. In 2008, archaeologists excavating the grounds of St. John's College, Oxford, discovered a mass grave. The remains of 37 young males, most between 16 and 25 years of age, bore signs of a frenzied attack. Axe wounds to the back, skulls crushed from behind, and charring on the bones. There were no defensive wounds. They had been unarmed. Chemical analysis suggested that the victims were Viking in origin, and DNA linked at least one of them to Otterup in Denmark. These were not raiders in the act. They were running. The massacre was not isolated to Oxford. At Ridgeway Hill, near Weymouth, archaeologists uncovered 54 beheaded Scandinavian males buried in a mass grave, dated to around the same period, though it is uncertain whether this was also part of the St. Brice's Day killings. The similarity in violence and dating is striking, and yet the Danelaw regions of England, with a long-standing Danish presence, remained largely calm. This, combined with charters and land grants Ethelred later made to Danes, leads many scholars to conclude that the massacre was localized, targeting military-aged men in areas where threats of treachery were highest. Historian Levi Roche, in his biography of Ethelred, warns against viewing the massacre as strategic genius. These purges bred suspicion and division at a critical moment, and in the end, Ethelred's death was soon followed by the conquest of England by the Danish ruler Cnut. Among the dead, historical accounts claim, was Gunhilda, the sister of King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark, and her husband Palig Tokason, a former ally of Ethelred. Whether this is true or apocryphal, the Danish response was real. Svein invaded England in 1003, ravaging southern towns with renewed fury. Ethelred's power dwindled rapidly. By 1013, Svein forced Ethelred into exile. And by 1016, Svein's son, Cnut the Great, was crowned King of England. The massacre intended to secure Ethelred's kingdom may have accelerated its collapse. Historians remain divided. Some view Ethelred's order as reckless and destabilizing, while others consider it a grim but calculated move given the circumstances. Ian Howard and Barbara York both suggest the killings were responses to mercenary betrayal, not an attempt at ethnic cleansing. The massacre was committed in response to the treachery of Ethelred's mercenary army, writes Howard. In contrast, Roche and Anne Williams stress the long-term damage it caused, both politically and morally. Williams writes, "The decree was not aimed at the English of Scandinavian descent living in the eastern shires, but it sowed the seeds of division Ethelred could not control." Even Simon Keynes, sympathetic to Ethelred's plight, concedes, The events of St. Brice's Day are a stark reminder of how fear and power can shape the darkest chapters of a kingdom's story. The St. Brice's Day Massacre remains one of the most haunting episodes of Anglo-Saxon England, not only for the violence it unleashed, but for what it reveals about leadership in a time of fear. It was an act of state-sanctioned brutality, not unlike those found throughout human history. A king overwhelmed by foreign invasion, internal betrayal, and mounting anxiety, lashed out. He succeeded only in inviting more bloodshed and in paving the way for a foreign ruler to claim his throne. The Viking Age in England did not end with the creation of the Danelaw. Though Alfred the Great had secured a fragile peace, the desire for total Norse control of England had not faded. The Danelaw remained Viking in culture and governance, but the rest of England remained under Anglo-Saxon rule, led by the kings of Wessex. For over a century, tensions simmered beneath the surface. The Danelaw's Viking rulers had assimilated into English society, intermarrying with Anglo-Saxon nobility, yet the dream of a united North Sea empire, one where England, Denmark and Norway would be ruled by a single Norse king, persisted. In 1013 AD, that ambition was reignited when the Danish king Svein Forkbeard launched a full-scale invasion of England. Unlike the great heathen army of the 9th century, which had sought to carve out Viking settlements, Svein's goal was clear. He intended to claim the English throne for himself. Svein's invasion was swift and devastating. He led his forces directly into the heart of England, burning towns, toppling strongholds, and forcing King Ethelred the Unready into exile. By December 1013, Svein had achieved the unthinkable. He had been declared King of England, the first Viking ruler to claim the entire country, but his reign was short-lived. Svein died suddenly in February 1014 before he could consolidate his power. His unexpected death threw the conquest into chaos. The exiled King Ethelred returned, reclaiming his throne, but in Denmark, a young prince swore to finish what his father had started. His name was Cnut the Great. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking Expansion, explains, Svein Forkbeard's conquest was the culmination of over a century of Viking ambition. His sudden death was a setback, but his son Cnut would prove to be an even greater ruler. Cnut was no ordinary prince. Raised in a warrior culture, he had spent his youth fighting alongside his father in campaigns across the North Sea. By the time he launched his invasion of England in 1015, he was already an experienced military commander, hardened by battle, and determined to succeed where his father had failed. In September 1015, Cnut landed in England with a massive fleet, launching a relentless campaign of conquest. His forces marched through the country with ruthless efficiency, seizing control of major Viking strongholds in the Danelaw. By early 1016, he had defeated multiple Anglo-Saxon armies, proving that his invasion was no mere raid. It was an organized, calculated bid for power. Standing in his way was King Edmund Ironside, the son of Ethelred, who had now become the last hope for Anglo-Saxon resistance. Edmund was a fierce warrior, earning his epithet Ironside for his unwavering determination in battle. He refused to surrender England without a fight. The war between Cnut and Edmund culminated in one of the most decisive battles in English history. The final clash between Edmund Ironside and Cnut took place at Sandun, in what is now Essex. This was not just another battle. This was the moment when Anglo-Saxon England's fate was decided. The Anglo-Saxons fought with desperate ferocity, knowing that their entire kingdom was at stake. The Vikings, battle-hardened and strategically superior, held their ground, refusing to be pushed back. After a long and brutal struggle, Cnut's forces broke through the English lines, slaughtering thousands. Eleanor Parker in Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, describes the battle. The fields of Sandun ran red with blood. It was not just a military defeat, It was the final collapse of the old Anglo-Saxon order. Edmund, though still alive, knew that further resistance was futile. Rather than continue the war, he agreed to a truce with Cnut, dividing England between them. However, fate intervened. Just weeks later, Edmund died under mysterious circumstances, leaving Cnut as the uncontested ruler of England. The Viking dream of a North Sea empire had finally been realized. Cnut's rule marked a dramatic turning point in English history. Unlike previous Viking warlords who had ruled through terror and force, Cnut set out to establish a lasting and stable kingdom. He did not see himself as a mere conqueror. He saw himself as the rightful king of England. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of Ethelred, strengthening his claim to the English throne. He rewarded both Viking and Anglo-Saxon nobles, ensuring loyalty from both sides. He embraced Christianity, presenting himself as a defender of the church rather than a pagan invader. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Cnut the Great, writes, Cnut understood that ruling England required more than just military dominance. He had to be a king for both Danes and Saxons, a ruler who could unite rather than divide. Cnut transformed England into a central part of his vast North Sea empire, which included Denmark, Norway, and parts of Sweden. His kingdom was one of the most powerful in Europe, stretching across the North Atlantic and controlling key trade routes. He strengthened England's economy, integrating it into a wider Viking trading network. He introduced new laws, ensuring fairness between his Anglo-Saxon and Danish subjects. He ruled with both firmness and diplomacy, maintaining stability across his realm. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes Cnut's legacy. Cnut was a Viking warrior, but he was also a king who understood the art of governance. His reign was not just about conquest, it was about creating a kingdom that could endure. Cnut ruled England for nearly 20 years, bringing peace and prosperity to a land that had known only war for generations. But in 1035 AD, he died suddenly, and his empire began to unravel. His sons, Harald Harefoot and Harthacnut, failed to maintain his legacy, leading to infighting and division. By 1042 AD, the Anglo-Saxon royal line was restored under Edward the Confessor, ending nearly 30 years of Viking rule in England. Though the Danelaw persisted for a time, the dominance of Viking kings was over. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking expansion, reflects on Cnut's reign. Cnut had achieved what no Viking had done before. He had ruled England as a true king, but without his leadership, his empire crumbled. It was the last great chapter of the Viking Age in England. Though Viking rule ended, the legacy of Cnut's reign endured. His influence on England's governance, law, and culture remained long after his kingdom had faded. The Viking Age in England had ended, but its mark on history was indelible. For nearly 3 centuries, the Vikings had shaped the history of England, from the first raids in 789 AD to the great invasions of the 9th and 10th centuries. The Norse had been an ever-present force, a nightmare to some, a ruling class to others. They had carved out the Danelaw, toppled Anglo-Saxon kings, and even placed their own rulers on the throne. But by the mid-11th century, the Viking world was changing. The once feared Norse warriors were no longer the same unstoppable raiders that had terrorized monasteries and kingdoms alike. The great Viking kings, Cnut, Svein Forkbeard, and Olaf Tryggvason, were dead. The North Sea Empire had crumbled. England, though still bearing the scars of Viking rule, had fallen back into the hands of the Anglo-Saxon kings. Yet there was one last attempt, one final bid by the Vikings to reclaim England and restore Norse rule. That final act was led by Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king. Timothy Bolton, in The Empire of Cnut the Great, explains, by the mid-11th century, Viking expansion had slowed, but the dream of Norse conquest had not yet faded. Harald Hardrada's invasion of England was not just a political gamble, it was the last great roll of the dice for the Viking world. This is the story of how that final gamble ended in blood, steel, and fire at Stamford Bridge. Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, was no ordinary ruler. He was a warrior who had fought across the known world, a mercenary in the Varangian Guard of the Byzantine Empire, a seasoned general, and a man who believed in his divine right to rule England. As a boy, Harald had fought at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, where his half-brother, Olaf Haraldsson, was killed. He had spent years in exile, serving as a feared commander in Byzantium, before returning to reclaim the Norwegian throne in 1046 AD. By 1066, Harald was at the height of his power, ruling Norway with an iron grip and dreaming of conquest. Harald claimed that he was the rightful ruler of England, based on an old agreement between Cnut the Great and Magnus the Good. But in reality, his invasion was about glory and ambition, one last attempt to revive the Viking dominance of the past. Eleanor Parker, in Dragon Lords, describes Harald as the embodiment of the Viking warrior ideal, a man who had fought in a dozen lands, who had built his power through the sword, and who believed that fate had chosen him to be King of England. But Harald was not the only man with a claim to the English throne. In 1066, England was on the brink of chaos, and three men stood ready to fight for its crown. Harold Godwinson, the Anglo-Saxon King of England; Duke William of Normandy, a distant relative of the English royal family; Harald Hardrada, the Viking warrior king of Norway. The stage was set for the most dramatic year in English history. In September 1066, Harald Hardrada launched one of the largest Viking invasions of England in history. His fleet, numbering over 300 longships, set sail across the North Sea, carrying an army of around 10,000 Norse warriors. It was the greatest Viking force to land on English shores in over a century. Harold allied himself with Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's king, Harold Godwinson. The Viking army landed in northern England, ravaging the countryside as they advanced. On the 20th of September 1066, they defeated an Anglo-Saxon army at the Battle of Fulford, near York. The victory at Fulford seemed to confirm Harold's destiny. The Viking army had crushed its first real opposition. York, the old Viking stronghold of Jorvik, surrendered to him without a fight. The path to the English throne appeared wide open. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking expansion, notes, Harald Hardrada's invasion was the last great expression of Viking ambition, but it was also a reckless gamble, one that would cost him everything. Then, everything changed. Harold expected King Harold Godwinson to take weeks to respond. After all, the English king was in the south, preparing for an invasion by William of Normandy. But Harold moved faster than anyone expected. In just 5 days, Harold Godwinson and his army marched 190 miles north, covering a staggering distance in record time. On 25th September, he caught the Vikings completely off guard at Stamford Bridge. The Viking army was relaxed, unprepared for battle. Many had left their armour behind, expecting further negotiations with the English. When the Anglo-Saxon army arrived, the Norse warriors were in disarray. The battle began with a desperate Viking defence as Harold and his men scrambled to form a shield wall. In the early fighting, Harold fought like a true Viking warrior, cutting down enemy soldiers with his massive two-handed axe. But then an arrow struck his throat, killing him instantly. The fall of Harald Hardrada broke the Viking resistance. His army, leaderless and outnumbered, was slaughtered by the Anglo-Saxons. Of the 300 longships that had brought the Vikings to England, only 24 returned to Norway. The Norse army had been annihilated. Neil Price, in Children of Ash and Elm, describes Stamford Bridge as the final moment of the Viking Age, a battle that ended with the death of the last great Norse king, and with him the last serious attempt at Viking rule in England. The Viking dream of England was over. Harold Godwinson's victory at Stamford Bridge was short-lived. Just 3 weeks later, on the 14th of October, 1066, he faced William the Conqueror at the Battle of Hastings. The English, exhausted from fighting the Vikings, were defeated by the Normans. Harold Godwinson was killed, and William became King of England. With this, the old Anglo-Saxon and Viking worlds faded, replaced by a new Norman order. Though Viking raids would continue for a few more years, the age of Norse rule in England was over. England had fallen not to the Vikings, but to the Normans, a people who, ironically, were descended from Vikings themselves. Peter Sawyer, in the Viking expansion, reflects, Stamford Bridge was the end of the old world. It was the last time a Viking army would fight for the throne of England. After 1066, the Vikings no longer shaped the fate of this land. The Viking Age in England began with a raid in 789 AD. It peaked with the Danelaw, the reign of Cnut, and the invasions of 1066. It ended with the deaths of Harald Hardrada and Harold Godwinson. After Stamford Bridge, the Viking world never again threatened England. The Norse had left their mark, but their time as conquerors was over. The Viking Age had ended. For nearly 3 centuries, the Vikings shaped the destiny of England, from their first raid in 789 AD to their final battle at Stamford Bridge in 1066. What began as a series of swift coastal attacks grew into a full-scale struggle for dominance over Anglo-Saxon England. We explored the pivotal moments that defined this era, the first Viking raids on Lindisfarne and Wessex, which heralded the coming storm, the great heathen army led by Ivar the Boneless, Halfdan and Guthrum, carving out Viking-ruled territories in England, the rise of Alfred the Great, who stood against the Norse tide and forged a path toward a unified Anglo-Saxon kingdom, the creation of the Danelaw, a land where Viking and Anglo-Saxon cultures merged, shaping the England we know today. Cnut the Great's North Sea Empire, the height of Viking power in England. The final invasion of Harald Hardrada in 1066, a bold but doomed attempt to reclaim England for the Norse. In the end, the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans, not the Vikings, would shape the future of England. But the impact of the Norse never truly faded. Their influence can still be found in English law, language, place names, and even our understanding of medieval warfare. To piece together this complex history, we relied on the research of prominent modern historians. Timothy Bolton, The Empire of Cnut the Great, a crucial study of Cnut's reign and Viking influence in England. Peter Sawyer, The Viking Expansion, a detailed exploration of Norse conquests and settlement. Eleanor Parker, Dragon Lords, The History and Legends of Viking England, a fascinating look at the cultural impact of the Norse in England. Neil Price, Children of Ash and Elm, a deep dive into Viking society and their warrior culture. Gareth Williams, Viking Britain, a compelling narrative of the Viking presence in the British Isles. Each of these historians has helped us understand not just what the Vikings did, but how they changed England forever. The Vikings may have fought for control of England, but they were not the only force shaping its destiny. While they raided, conquered, and ruled, the Anglo-Saxons were forging a kingdom of their own, one that would eventually unite and resist the Norse threat. If you want to understand the other side of this story, the rise of the Anglo-Saxon kings, their struggles, and their ultimate triumph, we invite you to watch our twin video, Anglo-Saxon Saga, The Long Road to United England. Discover how Alfred the Great, Edward the Elder, Ethelflaed, and Athelstan fought to create a single, unified kingdom, one that would stand even after the fall of the Viking Age. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our deep dives into medieval history.